Be nice. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Michael Rothberg, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of Gil Hochberg's book, Becoming Palestine, Toward an Archival Imagination of the Future, which will feature Gil in conversation with Sari Makdisi and Rachel Lee. This event is sponsored by UCLA's Working Group in Memory Studies. It's the first of 3 book discussions we'll be hosting this winter and spring, and they're all co-organized by Yair Agman, Rebecca Che, and Sharon Zelnick, along with myself. Our second discussion is going to feature the book Political Memory and the Aesthetics of Care, The Art of Complicity and Resistance by the political theorist Mihaela Mihai. And that's going to include discussion by Alison Landsberg and Andrew Schopp. And that's going to take place on Monday, March 14th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And then on April 27th at 2 p.m. Pacific, we're going to be hosting Kevin Brunel for a discussion of his new book, Settler Memory, The Disavowal of Indigeneity and the Politics of Race in the United States, with responses by Mishuana Goman and Hoesta Moehane. So I'm really excited about this whole series, and I'm particularly thrilled that we're beginning with this amazing and important new book by my friend and former UCLA colleague, Gil Hochberg. So I'm going to turn things over right now to Sharon Zelnick, who will introduce the speakers and will fill you in on the logistics for today's event. So welcome, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speakers. And before I do, I'll just ask that you please type your questions into the chat. There will be half an hour or so for an open Q&A after we hear from our panelists. So Gil Z. Hochberg is the Ransford Professor of Hebrew and Visual Studies, Comparative Literature and Middle East Studies at Columbia University. She is a member of the Executive Committee for the Center of Palestine Studies and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. She has published widely on a range of issues, including Francophone North African literature, Palestinian literature, gender and nationalism, cultural memory and immigration, Hebrew literature, Israeli and Palestinian cinema, trauma and narrative. In addition to Becoming Palestine, Toward an Archival Imagination of the Future, she is the author of Visual Occupations, Vision and Visibility in a Conflict Zone, and In Spite of Partition, Jews, Arabs, and the Limits of Separatist Imagination. Our 2 respondents, the first is Rachel C. Lee. She is a professor of English, Gender Studies, and the Institute of Society and Genetics at UCLA. She specializes in Asian American literature, performance culture, studies of gender and sexuality, and health humanities. She is the author of The Exquisite Corpse of Asian America, Biopolitics, Biosociality, and Posthuman Ecologies, and a founding editor of the journal Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience. Sari Makdisi is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at UCLA. His research and teaching focus on British Romanticism, imperial culture, colonial and post-colonial theory and criticism, and the cultures of urban modernity, particularly the revision and contestation of charged urban spaces, including London, Beirut, and Jerusalem. He is the author of Reading William Blake, Making England Western, Occidentalism, Race, and Imperial Culture, Palestine Inside Out, An Everyday Occupation, William Blake and the Impossible History of the 1790s and the Romantic Imperialism, and his latest book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial, will be published by the University of California Press this spring. So Gil, the floor is yours. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So excited to be here, really. Yes, so I will start with just a few opening comments. First of all, I want to thank the members of the Memory Studies Working Group, some of which I know well, Michael Rothberg, a dear friend, but also Sharon Zelnick, Yair Agman, and Rebecca Shai for inviting me for this great series, and I plan to join the other talks too. I am really delighted to be especially here at UCLA, although as I mentioned before, I'm not at UCLA. I'm actually 2,446.6 miles away. And I'm also 42 degrees away from you all. So I'm regretfully in my office at Columbia University. But it's very exciting to be in the presence of dear friends and colleagues from UCLA. I also wanted to thank particularly Sari Makdisi and Rachel Lee for joining me, and it's truly meaningful for me, and especially these two individuals where in each case there is a beauty, a poetic beauty to their being here. So in the case of Sari, I don't know if Sari remembers, but for me, it was a constitutional experience. So when my first book came out, Sari was my first interlocutor at an event in 2007 at the Levantine Cultural Center. And so I was thankful then, and I'm thankful now. So it's very meaningful to me. And for Rachel, it's very moving because I actually realized in a much later stage that it was during our meetings, of course, in our small and lovely working group was Rachel Lee and a few other members who maybe I can't see everybody, but maybe some of them are on the screen, that these initial ideas were coming in my head at the time. I really certainly didn't know that there is a book, but I remember actually specifically saying, I have no idea what I'm saying. And oftentimes it was Rachel who would say, but it's very clear what you're saying. So it's really, really delightful to have you both here with me. I'm going to try to keep my comments at the book to kind of bare minimum, with the hope that it will be intriguing enough and people would want to read the book, but also because I'm really curious to hear what others have to say about it. It's sort of always this strange situation where you talk about a book after it's done. And in this particular case, because of COVID, the manuscript was actually sitting at Duke Press from March 2020. So it's, it was sitting and initially people weren't working, and then there wasn't any paper. So there was literally a shortcut of paper. So, it's for me, it's a kind of a return, and I'm of course personally interested in hearing what others and people in the audience have to say or ask. So a few comments. So first of all, the book, which is right here next to me, Michael has one too, it's important for me to mention that it's a book about archival imagination and not about archives. So it's a book about how we can activate archives or the concept of archive, and not so much about the concept of archives themselves. The second point I would like to make is that I was asked actually in previous interviews that I've had if the book is an attack on history. So I want to say that yes and no. The book is not an attack on history in the sense that, the book is full of history. I mean, there's history being, narratives we tell about the past. It's not an attack on history. It is a call or a plea to release the authority that the discipline of history has and continues to have over archives and over the way we use and think about archives. And in that sense, what I'm trying to make clear in the book is that there is a certain way in which the discipline of history, capital D, capital H, has used archives, and it kind of continues to, despite the fact that we're actually no longer in the state where, frankly, most of us need to go into dark, dusty places. Most archives are digitalized. While there's, of course, places where there's a lot of censorship and the state is still very prominent in circulating archives, the reality is that there has been a great democratization globally of archives, simply in the sense that we can't really make the difference anymore, or a solid difference between data and archive. I mean, information circulates in ways that it has not circulated before. So part of the book tries to return to some of the earlier theories of archive and suggests that we're not there yet, that's any longer. And the other part is that there seems to still be some kind of an aura to the idea that what you do in archives is find information and facts, and those facts will reaffirm things as they were, and therefore we will understand better not how things used to be and how we are where we are. What I'm trying to suggest in the book is that in general, but most specifically in the case of Palestine, this modality has already reached what I call archival fatigue, in the sense that the act of a secret unveiled informs itself again and again and again, and it becomes a gesture, an empty gesture, in the sense that the discovery, for one, is of a secret that is already an open, known secret, and second, that because of that, and because of the fatigue, the political implications of the findings amounts to nothing. There is a sort of just, a list of another atrocity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the degree to which my critique of history comes in, and I'm very happy to talk about that in Q&A. Another aspect that I think is truly crucial for sort of understanding where I come to writing this book or thinking is the place of, and this I know I've had many conversations with Rachel, at least in the past, is the place of art and artistic expression. So the archival imagination that I talk to here, or what is in the subtitle Towards an Archival Imagination of the Future, is an imagination that I find in artistic expressions and in art that activates either archives themselves, particular findings of archives, or the figure of the archive, the concept of the archives. I would say that if I have to go through all of the examples in the book, the one thing that I think is shared by all of them is that all of these artworks return to archives, or the concept of the archives, by trying to do something, or that's my reading of it, do something to the temporality of the archive, suggesting that it is not the traces of the past that we are looking for, but actually traces of the future. So in turning the present into an archive, or learning to read the present as an archive, what one is looking for are traces of a future still unknown. And I think that's my main conception of what I mean by this imagination of the future, or archives for and of the future. Maybe the last point that I want to set out in advance is my the title, Becoming Palestine. And there's two elements here. One is, of course, the concept of becoming. So the concept of becoming, for anybody who knows Gilles Deleuze's work, would recognize that it is not my term, but his. And Deleuze uses the term in a way that I simply adopt, and I find very productive, to distinguish between, this is his quote, poetic political intervention on the one hand, end quote, and historical investigation on the other. Deleuze tells us that art has the potential to resist the teleology of history. And I sort of take that as a beginning for where I am thinking of how these particular artworks that I engage with help us realize that the present is never one, or it's never only the already immediately recognizable, but also hosts traces of unknown possibilities and potentiality. So one more thing about this idea of becoming an imagination and art. I think over and over in the book, I sort of kind of have a plea to the reader where I say our goal or our immediate task is to imagine. And I think I mentioned this because, again, one of the things that happens because history as a discipline does have an authoritative position over archives and in general over the quote unquote real, there are realms sort of mostly associated with representation in art and all kinds of artistic expressions that are considered quote unquote light, right? Cultural studies, things that, you know, people can do and they're nice, but they're certainly not something that is, you know, carries deep implications. I want to suggest that quite the opposite in this book, and I actually suggest that if there is any place where a meaningful political intervention takes place, it is certainly not in revisiting over and over again archives that we already know what will be found there, but actually in engaging seriously art as a concept, because I do insist, as I'm not alone in that, but that art thinks. And the other thing that I always take the opportunity to say in this regard is that in that particular sense, I'm willing to 100% accept that this project is very modernist, almost Adornian, in the sense that it has a very romantic perception of art, and that people who do not share this belief in the importance of art will most likely not be convinced, because you cannot, you know, convince one that that art thinks if one doesn't think so. So that is sort of a presupposition that I am willing to you know, hold fully. One last thing, and then I'll want to say something specifically about the artworks and show a few images. Becoming Palestine. So what I mean by it, I use the term Palestine specifically because, and I mentioned this in the book, because the term Palestine is a very, very rich, it's a very rich term. It's a very rich concept. It's a place, it's a historical place, it's a geographical place, but it's also a no place, and it's also a no state, and it's also a maybe will be state, and it's also a metaphor, and it's also part of what has a legacy of been discussed as a literary metaphor. And so all of those things together. The title, of course, Becoming Palestine, means a sort of becoming, and I take the list very seriously in the sense that it is not, this Palestine of becoming is not an entity that I know of or that anybody knows of. So it is not becoming Palestine again. It's a negation of another name that by definition in our political setting, the term Palestine, whether we like it or not, does negate another name of a similar area called Israel. So there is a negation here. But in that negation, there is an opening, and that opening is not an opening of return. It's an opening of a future yet to be. So that's all I want to say about that. The chapters themselves are chapters that talk about artistic various art. So there's essay films, I talk about literature, I talk about dance, about photography. So there's various genres. And I think I was thinking how to engage all of this, because of course the artists are the main source for my thinking. And it's very hard to do in a short talk. So what I was thinking is that I will just ask Michael to share a few of the images. I won't really say much about the images because frankly, it's impossible for me to engage closely with each one of them. But I will just mention first in that so one of the first chapter is a chapter dedicated to Jomana Mana's film, A Magical Substance. It's an unbelievable, flows into me. It's a wonderful film. Very briefly, this is a chapter that talks about her visiting the Israeli archive and finding in it explicitly Orientalist material about Arab music, and then using that material to make her own film. And one of the things that I do in tracing what she does in this film, and I do this in the other, some of the other works, is the place of citation and recitation. So I suggest that there is a way of citing and reciting that activates archives and moves them from a kind of stagnant place in the past into having a potential work on the present and future. So we can move to another image. Ruan Abu Rahim and Basil Abbas, this is really a work that is very hard to explain because it's actually a 4-year project that involved tours, and it involved exhibits, it involved a book project, and it involved a reproduction of a Neolithic mask that these two artists have found in, once again, in Israeli, this time in an Israeli archaeological archive. And so once again, there is an engagement with citation. What is remarkable about this work is the way that these two work with the concept of the copy and use it to challenge the idea of the authenticity as what it is that we're looking for when we are in the grips of archive fever. We can move further. This is also part of their work, and this is part of the work is that, again, they have organized tours with Palestinian youth in which they visit Palestinian villages within the 1948 territories that are not marked on the map. They collect certain plants and etc. from and ruins, and this becomes part of a new, what they call a living organic archive. We can move forward. Oh, these are so rich. It's just, it hurts me to talk about it so quickly. But this is Larissa Sansour's In the Future. This is In the Future They Ate from Finest Porcelain. This is a 25-minute, I believe, maybe longer, sci-fi film, which I read as a commentary on archaeology and on Zionism as a sci-fi political project. And I think there's one more image from this film. Yes, so you can see from the very little, just so it will at least, if not bring curiosity to the book, then at least to the films themselves, you can see how the work is done. It's so remarkable, the kind of purposely making the images seem archaic, seem like there's some kind of, you just can't tell if these are biblical figures, are these refugee camps in the back, and then the main figure who is the narrator terrorist, who during this film is also in psychoanalysis, finding out what is her trauma. And then the chapter is really about the relationship of archaeology and psychoanalysis, and how the film, in my own reading, suggests a replacement of digging with burial, which is once again a movement from the past to a future. We can move forward. This is from the film dance CIE, which stands for Cells of Illegal Education, by Farah Saleh, who is a remarkable dancer and performer. You can look her up. She has lots of works. She at the time that she did this and we were in touch, she was based in Ramallah, but I don't think she is now. I'm not sure where she is based, but it's too hard for me to explain what I do with it, but I just will stay with follow her work. Let's move. This is again part of the dance work, and I can just to grab your imagination, I will just say that in another work of hers is called Archive of Gestures. And she, in my engagement with her and her work, is all about what is the place of the body as an embodied archive? Because as an embodied archive, of course, it is in change and it is in mobility. So it defies the idea of a sealed and unchanging archive. Kamal Al-Jafri, so there's a chapter about several of his films and a remarkable project in which what he does is he has, in various ways, I can't go into the details, but he was born and raised in Jaffa. He uses the Israeli Cinematic Archive and he found that what there is an endless amount of images of Jaffa, and he makes his own films digitally by reworking the cinematic archive. And it is he does a lot of digital manipulation, where one of the things he does, for example, in this scene, this is a scene from an Israeli film with a very famous, the guy with the hat, if you can see it, a very famous Israeli actor who is playing in the film Casablanca, a very known film from the 70s. The figure in the front is Kamal's uncle, who he actually implanted in the film, right? So he uses a lot of digital manipulation. He inserts figures back into the Palestinian figures back into the frame. He also, in later films, actually finds a way to magnify in a way that he finds little almost hidden figures in windows. These are figures of Palestinians who just happened to be there at the time of shooting, but he's able to expose them, while in the original film, they're invisible. So it's, again, a manipulation and a work with the archive that brings out traces that are already in the frame, although they remain invisible without the acting on the frame. I believe this is the last image. Yes. So I'll end here and eager to hear.
Okay, I believe that I will be going first. So I'm unmuted. Okay, so let me begin. I want to thank the Memory Studies Group, Michael Rothberg, for inviting me to this gathering to celebrate Gil Hochberg's amazing book, Becoming Palestine, the third installment of a career-long engagement with late 20th and early 21st century cultural productions by artists both Arab and Jewish, Palestinian and Israeli, speaking from, back to, as well as perhaps around life in a hot conflict zone. And I would also like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. So to situate my comments today, I just want to give this caveat. My expertise lies not in Middle Eastern studies, nor archive studies, nor even in film and media. But my research and pedagogy goes towards the expansive work that's accomplished by literature, dance, theater, stand-up comedy, installation art, and museum display in relation to questions of race, biopolitics, and Orientalism. Hold on, I meant to turn on a clock. I will do that now, so I don't run over. Okay, there are three topics that I wish to raise in relationship to Becoming Palestine. The first is the time-bending affordances of narrative and critical theory that Hochberg brings to bear in relation to the artists she studies. The second is the significance of mood and affect as a through line across the varied works, putting forth an archival imagination of the future that Hochberg outlines. And here I'll just give a little teaser of where I'm going with that. The named emotion or affective orientation in the introduction is, I think it's a neologism, it's pesoptimism. But I want to suggest that there is underlying the selection of cultural works a distinct appreciation for something affective that is other than pesoptimism, and I'll elaborate a bit later. And then the third topic is the question of where these works stand, or where the project of naming the present as the archive of the future, and especially the imaginative, open-ended, not already materialized but virtual archive, where that stands in relationship to social production and feminist and queer theorizing. And I am teaching a class on feminist and queer theorizing, so that may be part of the inspiration for the question or the topic, but there is also evidence of gender feminist inquiry as part of Hochberg's interpretive lens, but it gives way, I think, to something like undecidability. And so I'll try to map that a little bit and then ask Gil for whether they see it in the same way or differently. Okay, so topic one. Time bending is part of Hochberg's argument with regard to contemporary Palestinian cultural workers who construct an imaginative archive for the future. If others like Laura Kong have stressed the profoundly undemocratic character of historical archives, and still others, like Saidiya Hartman, the importance of critical fabulation to address in part the violences and omissions of the same, Hochberg's maneuver is both to contextualize the artists featured in her study as grappling with an archive-saturated era, and to emphasize as virtues rather than deviations from the real and the authentic, those elements of these artists' works that are speculative, counterfactual, and virtual, not yet materialized. Typically, archives get activated as motivated narrations of what has happened in the past towards ends of solidifying state power. Yet, as Hochberg emphasizes, minor archives, refugee archives, diaspora archives, and queer ones can be means for contesting state power. Claiming that future aspirations, communities, and solidarities cannot be found in pre-existing archives and must be created through speculative ones, Hochberg leans into Deleuze's notion of becoming. You've heard a little bit already about that, but this quote is, "Becoming requires speculating beyond an actuality, held in place by pre-existing political terms, such as state, empire, nation, or people. Art opens the actual universe onto new universes or lands," end quote. The main feat, and it is a brilliant one, of Becoming Palestine then, may lie less in the deft close readings and crisp historicizations of contemporary Palestinian cultural production, of which there is an abundance, but in Hochberg's critically performing the time-traveling orientation we will need to adopt so as to fully appreciate these works' salience, their value to future generations and collectives who truly believe, and here I'm quoting someone I just taught, Robin Wall Kimmerer, that all flourishing is mutual. So the key question of the introduction, to my mind, is, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it's mostly in the quotation here, is, do we archive a pre-existing community, or can a community we would like to conjure become the outcome of an archive? Precisely because, quote, imagination always precedes political change, end quote, Hochberg posits these engaged artistic endeavors of Palestinians as necessary for both, quote, historical Palestine and today's Israel to undergo a process of becoming, end quote. So I'm now moving on to topic 2, the significance of mood and affect in this project. So I've already mentioned pesoptimism, which is a split figuration, bespeaking pessimism about current politics and optimism about, quote, the power of the imagination, end quote, to conjure a collective that can become otherwise to the now. But to my mind, all the chapters, and especially chapters 4 and 5, so these are the ones on, and yet my mask Powerful, and then the dance, CIE, Cells of Illegal Education, aren't so much pess optimistic, but something like resilient, exuberant, mischievous, good enough. And I'm thinking, when I say this last thing, claustrally appreciative, I'm thinking of an iconic movement towards the end of CIE, where people are moving kind of bound together, tightly embracing, and a kind of group hug. All of these affective motives are distinctly not in the register, and maybe even temper or balance out paranoia and moral outrage. But, these are terms from Eve Sedgwick. Does that mean the mood is depressive or reparative? And I would say perhaps not. There are moods that Hochberg steers away from in examinations of these archival interventions and archival imaginings, or prompts to more archival imaginings. So for instance, in the chapter on "And Yet My Mask is Powerful," this is the one of touring Palestinian ruins with other Palestinians with these 3D printed Neolithic masks. These events are characterized as not nostalgic, nor acts of mourning, right? And then there's also a kind of hacktivist ethos, because Abu Ram and Abbas also, they send out constructed media news items, right, that are characterizing a kind of, I don't know if it's a bacchanal, but I think with masks it's got to be a bacchanal, a kind of these bacchanalic youth gathering in ways that are irreverent, right? That can induce fearfulness, or it can induce a kind of laughter, right? So ruins are no longer, this is a quote, "Ruins are no longer sites of destruction, but opportunities from which to think about the incomplete nature of the colonial project, and through which to activate a potentiality to become unbound from colonial time." That's in relationship to "And Yet My Mask is Powerful," Gill's reading of it. And in general, the characterization of the quality or energy of these future-oriented imaginative works is also not toward the utopian, which is inherently exclusionary, nor towards the idealistic, that is, they do not exhibit a fascist longing for purity or perfection. They are, in short, not primarily earnest. Indeed, I could sense Gill's delight at the mischief-making and playfulness of many of these works. They're less than solemn, and definitely not melancholic affective quail. So I wondered as to why, or maybe I'm just completely wrong, that is a possibility as well, but I wondered as to why there was a backing away from naming levity as important. I sensed a degree of underplaying, also the degree to which the curator or critic and explicator activates these archives of the future, and also appreciates their repertoires, which are levity leavened, and I mean like yeasted with a release and breath and air of something like laughter. These exquisite para-archival mobilizations of photos, bodies, commemorative gatherings, milieu of memory, and speculative reactivations that provide a kind of fish broth. And here I'm thinking of Audra Simpson talking about a hunger striker, an indigenous hunger striker, who did not stop eating, but used a traditional practice of fish broth, which is used in starvation conditions in the Canadian North. So it provides a kind of fish broth, a sustenance that perhaps draws from Levantine wisdom and creativity to provide nourishment for the body-mind to continue persisting and living on. Finally, on just the same point, I wanted to name it levity or breath, but it became spoken of in the introduction as the interrogative, the theoretical, the self-reflexive, and the open-ended, because still opaque. Opaque is my word, but there are several times in the book which lands on the refusal or resistance to interpretation, or the way in which interpretation, there's an invitation to it, interpretation, but also interpretation gets deflated. Okay, so this naming a levity as promoting ease or release takes me to this final topic. Okay, oh, thank you, yes, it's Teresa Spence, the fish broth. The naming of levity and promoting of ease and release takes me to the final topic, which is reproductive labor, social reproduction, and intimate zones of the domestic. And this comes up specifically, it's named specifically by Hochberg in chapter 1, for instance, on Jumana Mana's A Magical Feeling, when there's a conversation around having, trying to cook Moroccan food, and the conversation is in the kitchen. It's around an intimate zone of, salient reproductive labor, of cooking. There's also frameworks of gender and queer intimacy crop up as well in the acknowledgement of minor archives, not the archives of war, men's exploits, their victories, or preparations for battle. So my desire was for Hochberg to pursue how openness and perhaps even optimistic futurity was hearkening to, but perhaps also in tension with, feminist theory and queer articulations of non-hetero, non-gender binarized reproductive labor. And here I'm thinking specifically of Fares Saleh's Cells of Illegal Education, or CIE. It's homage, deviation, or as well as reinflections of gendered courtship rituals and love triangles that are in the tradition of high school musicals, and the replacement or inflecting of these courtship kinetics, strutting, the coy tucking of the hair behind the ear, which is now a meme apparently, with ungendered motions of locking and loading, as well as ballistic recoil from having been shot. So the move is not just to notice gender. There's a kind of noticing of an inclusion of a photograph in the archive that has all men who have just successfully had a class in the lab. There's an inclusion and replacement of several women in the reproduction of that photo before the choreography, the stillness starts moving. So the move is not just to notice gender, but also articulate it's being pushed aside without settling on whether that is good or bad. And so that's a kind of open-ended rumination and a prompt for thinking more. But I will just finish by saying, read this book. It is brilliant. I want to now go, and I did go to some of the original works to see what I could see. And it's that work is done, and the theoretical maneuvers are amazing. That's it. That's where I'll close.
I guess that means I go next. I want to thank Michael and the Center for organizing this event. And I'm also thankful, of course, to Gil for writing this amazing book, and to Rachel for setting up our follow-up discussion. So I'm going to approach this a little bit differently from Rachel, in that my reaction to the book was enormously positive, and I found it moving and compelling in all kinds of ways. What it raised in me, above all, was a series of questions that are, I guess they're kind of for Gil, but they're also kind of for myself. They're kind of for whoever wants to think about them, by way of reaction, really. So it's like the book made me think about several different questions. But I want to say, first of all, by way of opening, that the basic premise of the book, I mean, the basic kind of theoretical claim that Gil is making in the book, which is that an archive shouldn't just be a place for us to go to kind of reconstruct the past, or to go back to some past before the past, or to renegotiate even the relationship between past and present, but rather as an opportunity for us to think about how the relationship between past, present, and future can be articulated in all kinds of ways. That's something that I find very powerful and compelling, and I find it powerful and compelling not just in the case of Palestine, although maybe above all Palestine, but also as a way of thinking about the relationship between sort of calamitous present day, or for that matter, calamitous pasts, and possible futures that take us away from here. And William Blake, about whom I've written a little bit, this is exactly what he refers to as the concept of impossible history. It's sort of how can we kind of re-narrate almost re-narrate the future by thinking also historically and in terms of the present. I think that's a lot of what Gil is doing in this book by thinking about these different Palestinian kind of artistic interventions. I think the whole question of, to follow Gil as she does, to think about the future to think about how we can approach the future as a matter of how we read the past, and discovering traces of potentiality in the archive for the future is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly exhilarating, liberating, and I really enjoyed the book in that sense, and I'd strongly urge everybody else to read it as well. I have to say, if I had to pick out one particular favorite text of all the texts that Gil discusses in the book, it would be the Kamal al-Jafari films. But I have to also, at the same time, this is actually one of the questions I want to ask. I have to say, I haven't seen these films. I don't even know how to see the films, even if I wanted to. I do want to, but I don't know. I don't even know where to find them. And that's a question I have. But based on Gil's explication of them, which of course I trust wholeheartedly, he seems to really be onto something here in terms of trying to find the sort of the stubborn Palestinian presence in cities like Jaffa, for example. But I also want to reflect just one more time about the title that Gil gives the book, Becoming Palestine, because there's so much. I mean, part of what makes Palestine special is that it's a place that it's almost like it's as she talks about a lot of this in the book as well, but it's simultaneously a place and a concept and an idea and a hope and a symbol and a memory. It has all these. I mean, there are very few places that actually have that kind of that can operate in so many dimensions, so many temporal and historical and political dimensions as well. And I think she's really on to something here. I do have a question about the future, but that's something I'll come back to in a little bit. So let me just go through the questions that came to my mind while, either while reading the book or in reaction having read the book. First of all, the question of the archive itself, and as Gil says, I think quite powerfully in the opening, I guess the preface and the introduction of the book, and then she comes back to it in later chapters as well. The whole question about what constitutes an archive and how one can find and locate an archive, and the kind of I suppose you could say the debate around what's the word, the factuality, facticity, whatever the word is, the factualness of the archive. What she says on, I think it's on page 28. Sorry, I lost the page number, but she says the problem we face is not a denial of facts, but rather thinking through. In other words, she's saying that we're not there. There will be no further. The archives have no more secrets for us. We've uncovered all the secrets of the archives, and now basically the facts, as all the facts that need to be laid out have been laid out, and they're there for us to kind of work through. And I know what she's saying, but I don't know that the facts have entirely been accepted. I think that there's still I think that denial still plays a very prominent role, and a very powerful role, and a kind of a very basic role too, in terms of how one can talk about the question of Palestine, whether past, present, or above all, in some sense, future. So the question of, it seems to me that like further thinking through of the question of denial is paramount here, because of the ways in which, first of all, there has been extensively a logic of denial, and secondly, even access to certain archives is still very much off limits. I mean, for example, famously or infamously, the Israeli State Archive, for example, the collections that it has on the massacre at Deir Yassin in 1948 are still off limits, which is kind of extraordinary for something that happened, in 1948 itself. So we have access to many things, but some things are still considered to be off limits for whatever kinds of reasons. So the whole question of whether we can actually get to the archive, and then the question of, are we really all on a common ground in terms of facts, and the role that denial might still play. Those seem to me to be still kind of live questions. The second thing, and it's kind of, obviously it's sort of related, is the fraught and contested nature of the archive. An archive, whatever one means by an archive, whether one means like, a state archive or a collection of some kind, or a museum or just, a collection of texts and images and so forth, and Gill works with all those different kinds of meanings of the word archive. But however one means it, an archive isn't like equal access kind of territory, right? I mean, archives they're still kind of held, they're still guarded, they're still protected in various kinds of ways. People are still are allowed in or kept out to, to different sorts of extents. So there's still live questions in terms of openness and access to archives, whatever one means by archive. And as I said, for example, I would love to see the Kamal al-Jafari films that she talks about in chapter 2, I think it is. But I don't have access to them for various kinds of reasons. And so I think that's important. I also think it's important, and this is something that Gill actually talks about extensively in the book as well, the ways in which certain archives, like for example, I mean, she says this very powerfully at the beginning of the book too. The Israelis in 1948 captured a gigantic Palestinian archive of, again, archives of various sorts, including a textual archive, a photographic archive, but archive of villages too, archive of towns and places and territories and so on, depending on what one means by archive. And all those things are still kind of, guarded in various sorts of ways. After the siege of Beirut in 1982, the Israelis seized the PLO archive that was held in Beirut. In 2002, when they retook the West Bank, they seized another set of Palestinian archives. I mean, so archives are places, they're still territories to be, taken, seized, protected, fought over, contested, and so forth. And it's not quite as, access to them isn't quite as voluntary. I'm not saying that Gill says that they're voluntary, but this is one of the questions that came to my mind in response. The part of the book that I found most compelling and most powerful, and it's one that also got me thinking a lot, has to do with the, as she says, the ways in which we might find traces of the future in the present, because the question of how we can imagine looking at such a calamitous present built on a calamitous past, a series of pasts, how we could access and even start thinking about what possible futures might look like, seemed to me to be well worth considering. But here again, the question of who has access to that, to even imagining a future, for whom is that possible? What kind of work does it take to process thoughts and imaginations and hopes? Who is allowed to have hopes? Who isn't allowed to have hopes? I mean, all those things are, again, they're not exactly open access. I'm not saying that Gill says that they are. Obviously, she doesn't. But I just think that those sorts of things, those are the sorts of things that prompted more thinking on my part. And the one case that I kept coming back to as I was reading Gill's work has to do with the work of the Palestinian geographer Salman Abu Sitta. Gill refers to his work somewhere in passing in the book, but not the book I have in mind is actually, it's this, it's the Arabic, The Return Journey. And what's amazing about it is it has a map in it. Well, I mean, the basic premise of the book is, it actually does exactly what Gill is talking about. It's on the one hand, it's an archive of the villages, the Palestinian villages and towns that were demolished during the Nakba in 1948 and long after the Nakba, because the demolitions went on into the 1950s and 60s. So on the one hand, it's an archive of the past. On the other hand, it's an archive of a kind of present, because its invitation to the reader is, if you want to tour these places, and I'll show you a map in a second, these are among the trajectories you could consider taking. And it's also, remarkably, it's an archive, if you want, of the future, because it's about return. And it's almost like literally mapping how one could imagine a Palestinian return, the return of the refugees, for example, and the kinds of spatial trajectories that first of all, that they took to their dispossession in the overwhelming majority of cases, and then secondly, how that could be turned around. So let me just, if I could, I think I can do this, quickly share just that one map. I think it's here. I think you can see it. Can you see this thing? Yeah. So it's this map here. So it's a series of trajectories, and as I said, what they're doing is this is, as you can tell, this is kind of a shadowy outline of Palestine. Gaza would be down here. The West Bank, as you can see, is missing here, because this is pre-48 Palestine here. And what's happening is he's simultaneously mapping where, the past of destruction, the present of, if you want, reclamation, and the future of return, kind of simultaneously. So it really is a kind of overlapping set of maps of past, present, and future. And it seems to me like a perfect case of the kind of thing that Gil is talking about, in the sense that the archive of the past is no longer, it's not about going back to something, it's about what one can find in the future by looking at archives of the past and the present. So that's, I mean, again, it's just jumped to me based on the way, on how the narrative of Gil's book, the argument of Gil's book unfolds. So I thought that was particularly compelling. So I want to clarify, these aren't meant to be questions for Gil, because that's not the point. These are the questions that occurred to me having read the book and in the process of reading the book. So I hope that's helpful.
So these were two remarkable presentations. I mean, I first of all want to thank you both for engaging so closely and seriously. And it only just saddens me profoundly that we're on the screen, because I really have a strong urge to hug both of you. But I'm, I don't know, Michael, I don't want to take, I don't want to take too much time. Should I?
You're welcome to say a few words in response if you'd like, or we can open, and then we can open it up however you want.
That's great. So yeah, I mean, I think these are just terrific comments, and the way that the two presentations work together gave me so much to think of. So it's just, it's really moving. So let me start with Rachel, who, it's Rachel. Rachel has a mind that, I mean, no wonder I always, wanted Rachel to, be in my reading group, because, it's just really like the way that you're tuned to these very careful moments is so remarkable. I want to say, yes, you're right that the affective movement, I mean, there's definitely a mischievousness and almost in all of them a certain kind, I mean, different. And you're right that in the chapters that you mentioned, the work, the dance work, and the work by Abu Raham in Abbas, there is more openly celebration of kind of a mischief act. I do at some point, I think in the introduction, do say that there is a joy, right? So there is a joy. You're right that in a way, I think that the works have more than I have allowed them in my reading. And I take that now very seriously. I think, I was sort of like, well, this is a very serious matter, right? And I'm the critic. So, but I think that's very, very true. And I think that what you were saying about the queer and feminist reproduction and the entire question of the gender implication of it is something that I thought of more closely right after. And actually, there is an essay that I wrote after, the only thing that I wrote after this book, because after that I became chair and my life has become a disaster. But sorry, everybody, that I had to kvetch. But before I was chair and I was still a functioning human being, I wrote this one other essay, which I returned to Jumana Mana, but in a different set of films. And it's a completely, basically, I do a very sort of a feminist and queer reading. And so I sort of totally hear you on this. And I think that, I have the simple answer that people give. When you're focused on some, you're writing a book and a manuscript and you're focused on a certain kind of argument, and the rest somehow, despite the fact that these are questions that are so close to my heart and my life and my, they kind of flipped out. And I think that, yes, there would be definitely more for room for more of engagement with that. And I think in many of the works, it's definitely present. So thank you for these comments. Sorry, again, thank you so much for your generous reading. Let me just say, I fully agree that denial is in operation. I think the point I wanted to make about denial is that denial, the fact is that as you see in the example that I give of Benny Morris and the famous example, is that the fact is that facts don't do anything to denial, because the question of denial is really a question of will and of moral implication, right? So I'm not saying it's not important to find facts. I'm just saying that the political effectiveness of facts proves to do very little. And in fact, over time, and we know this from other contexts, right? Over time with atrocities, there is usually a certain period of time where facts matter. And after a while, what I call this archival fatigue, it almost turns the opposite. And then you get in the extreme case, you get the Trumpist, where it's like, these are just, an abundance of facts. So what does it mean? That they're not real, because we see so many of them, right? So, I mean, in a way, we want facts to matter, but the sad fact is that they tend not to. So that's my main point about that. Two other things. Access to archives, very important. And, in the book, there's some places where I do talk about it. I mean, the fact, for example, that Jomana is a Palestinian with an Israeli citizenship is what enables her. I mean, that's why she can access the Israeli archive, right? Not every Palestinian, of course, can do that. And you have works, Emily Jassir's whole body of work, really, in which she takes digital photos of confiscated Palestinian books in Israeli archives in order to sort of emphasize that that all you have is the digital photo, right? That you can sneak out. So of course that is there, and I would never deny that. I think there's a lot of complexity. I don't want to, there's a lot of complexity with it, because the question of access and state archives, I think the problem with the focus, or the only focus on it, is two. One is that there really does, it's a discourse that starts circulating as a fetish. So it becomes this, and actually another text that I am in the process of writing is how the Israeli state, especially the IDF archives, actually uses that and quite extensively, because there is sort of like open and close and open and close. And these files are now open. Then, the 1982 now files are open. And then they're open for 4 months, and then they're closed. And then the end result is that the entire discourse becomes actually about the archive and about who has access. And all the facts, etc., become significantly less important, right? It's like people are chasing after, and it's closed, and it's open, and it's open, and it's closed, and it really actually becomes, the text that I'm writing, it becomes an object of desire, right? Who gets to touch the confiscated material that is held in the IDF, and it's actually propelled by IDF propaganda. You can open the IDF webpage and you will see, so-and-so days archive is open. It's quite funny, or not. But so that's one thing. The other thing, and I do mention it in the book, and that actually didn't come from me. It came from the artists that I interviewed. And it's the only book where I really also interview artists, which I want to mention because I thought it was very important to actually, and there's a lot of integration of what artists say in this book. And one of the things that struck me as this overall very young generation, all of these artists are young, is that they had a certain, and all of them in different ways said the same thing. that goes back, sorry, to your question of who is allowed to imagine, which was, it's our right to imagine. And it's sort of like I said at some point, how many times does an atrocity, how many times does a victim need to prove that an atrocity has occurred? How many times do victims have to do that labor, right? Rather than be mischievous, rather than imagine, rather than play and create masks, which they do. And I heard that many times from the artists. And I think there really is also, in this case, a particular generational move from sort of, yes, there still is the commitment to narrate, but we can't be subjected to that commitment because we want to, be part of a world that imagines and hopes, etc. And then, there is the whole issue of how art world circulates. And I think these artists also do, and justifiably so, want to be part of a global world, of contemporary art, show and biennales, and not be burdened by a kind of aesthetic that is perceived in advance as, a good, did good on the quote unquote Palestinian front, right? So I think that's really, a lot of it comes from the artists themselves. But thank you both. It's wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to think about all of this a lot.
Thank you all for that incredibly rich conversation. And yes, for this phenomenal book, which I am excited to teach part of in my upcoming seminar this spring. So now we'll open up questions to everyone, and Michael wrote one in the chat, as did Doug Rasanow. So Gil, would you like me to read them to you, or would you like to?
Sure.
Okay, I'll read Michael's. You talked about how the book is sometimes read as an attack on history, but I also read it as an attack on nationalism, in particular anti-colonial nationalism. Is this fair, and what are the implications of that for thinking about resistance?
Yeah, that's fair. Yes, I wouldn't say an attack on nationalism as much as, and I think maybe it goes back to something that Rachel says, as much as the idea that the collective for which the archive is created, or for which it addresses, is a kind of an us that is still unknown, right? An us in becoming. And so it's as much an attack on nationalism as it is on ethnic configurations or any other kind of configuration that has a strong hold on the limits of or the borders of what that imagined us is to become, right? In this context, I think there are several of the artists I discussed do have a very direct engagement, a critical direct engagement with nationalism and the limits of nationalism as for some as considered part of a still Orientalist or colonial European construct, and for others as limiting for gender reasons, and for others as limiting simply in terms of not being conducive to the present, as in particularly the present in Palestine, Israel at the moment, and what kind of configuration of population it offers. If you take that space right now demographically and read that as an archive of the future, how productive is it to read it in terms of anti-colonial nationalism?
Yes, definitely. And Michael just added, I know that Sari also likes Stanley Cohen's work on denial. I think his notion of imprecatory denial is relevant. Maybe, Sari, do you want to speak to this question? And then we'll jump to the next question and Kyla Wazana, if you could please put your question in the chat, I'll read it. Thank you.
Sorry, do you mean Michael's question on Stanley Cohen or Michael's first question to Gil? I mean, I guess I could talk about both. Stanley Cohen's book, it's called States of Denial. Well, he's written various things, but I think that's the book Michael has in mind. And Michael, I honestly don't remember which one, because he has great, a whole grid, and I forgot which one that is. I'm sorry, but
I think it's that notion that like you can accept the facts, but you deny the implications. It's supposed to
yeah. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
That seems to be part of what's at stake.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what's at stake. But then I still think that on the basic question of facts is still, I mean, I think it's beyond contestation at this point. But there's still like, the amnesty report that came out last week, whenever it was, about apartheid. It's still, people in the U.S. Congress and other places are still screaming and shouting and about how unacceptable a term that is. And it's like, it seems blatantly obvious to me. That's what we're talking about here. But so some facts are still, definitely not yet accepted. And I think that's an interesting thing. But yeah, the other question about the kind of, we may accept some facts, but yeah, we didn't do it, or like there's a kind of a shift away from agency and responsibility, and that kind of thing is also super important. I think that's true. But I mean, just to go back to what Gil was saying about nationalism, I mean, I agree. I think we've gotten to a point where I don't think nationalism was really ever part of a solution, but it's certainly not part of a solution right now, at least not nationalism as it used to be formulated and expressed. So this is an anti-colonial struggle, but it's no longer as it once was, I think, a national liberation struggle. I mean, that's something that Palestinians themselves debate quite hotly, I should say. So that's still an open question for many Palestinians. But I think increasingly the kind of nationalist contours of the struggle are shifting, and something else is taking its place, which I personally find interesting and exciting.
So while Sari is still spotlighted, I'll read Ethan Pack's question, which is relevant to both of you. Building off of Sari's question with a comparison to the work of Fraught began by focusing on documenting and proving the Nakba for Israeli Jews, and shifted to more artistic projects focused on the future of the refugees' return. What do these shifts to the future, to the imagination of the possible, say about the impossibility of addressing the present as it currently stands?
Hi, Ethan. Okay, what does it say about the impossibility of addressing the present as it currently stands? I think my answer would be that we don't have a present as it currently stands. I mean, we have presents. The question is, what do we, right? What kind of, how do we need to learn to read the present. There's the present that we learn about, which is, what amnesty says, or what, I don't know, the White House has, or what, and we're supposed to think that that's the present, because that's the political reality, so to speak. So realistic people, mature adults, that's reality. But of course, the present is, people living and in different, locations, and either with an intention of living differently or not, but it's made of all of those different inspirations. In terms of Fraught itself, I do write a little bit about some of the project of Fraught. I think the shift is actually maybe not in this particular case, not so much about like the past to the future, as much as really something that I think that Fraught have realized, which has to do with something that I'm trying to convey, which is that when you take people and you show them facts, let's say you take them on villages and you say, here, look, there was a village here, now it isn't here, and this is what happens. The question is, what is the political or ethical impact of this? How long will it last? How long does that happen? Does it, carry any effect? I mean, people also have, the world is full of tourist, what is called catastrophic tourism, right? I mean, people go to places, they look at atrocities, and then they go back. The question is, what actually mobilizes change? I think one of the things that Fraught have realized, although I don't know this for a fact, but is that people are invested in change when they are implicated somehow directly. If you are implicated in something, which means, this will become part of your possibilities of how you're going to wake up tomorrow, it's going to create an effect. If it's just going to be something that you will say, this was awful that it happened, and you learn that again and again and again, you will, not necessarily move into making any change. I think that's the main thing that I think Fraught as a practice have realized, and very smartly so. Not that I know that that's how they think, but that's how it looks to me, that their activities have changed towards actually reminding the Israeli audience, which is their main audience. They started by saying to people, you got to know the past, right? You got to know the history of the Nakba. And they did that. But I think they realized at some point, you got to know the present. You got to realize that the Nakba is now. This is the Nakba. It's not, there's, and let me just take this as an opportunity to say one thing I say in the book is that, we constantly say that Palestine is not an exception, that it's the same as everywhere. But there is one thing where it's actually not the same as everywhere. It's 70 years. What archive are we talking about? It's the present. Even the past is the present. It's now, right? So it's a reality. It's an urgent reality. It's a reality that is happening in the now. And what I argue in the book is that the massive amount of archival work, archaeological work, we didn't talk about archaeology, but the archaeology, the endless digging in Israel, Palestine, actually creates a past that doesn't belong to the very short history of the state of Israel and the Nakba. So I'm basically thinking that, or urging in the book to notice that it's a mistake to read the situation in Palestine as it's, this is the same as settler colonial everywhere. Yes and no. It's no in the sense that not only is it the present, but because it's the present, there is actually significantly, I think, more chances for change and intervention. So it's almost an optimistic appeal.
Okay, so our next question is also related to much of what you just brought up. Where does the right of return fit in this imagination, for example, in Auda, and what kind of imagination, what can imagination make possible? Can it play a role in the political adjunction of the Palestinian question, or is imagination all that is left? That's from Olivia Harris.
Olivia. I mean, the one thing is that I say at some point in the book that any successful political movement begins with imagination, right? The success of Zionism is that it's like a wild imagination. And it's successful because, not because of facts, it's successful because it had a way, and it still has a way, to compel people in this construction of imagination. So I would say that imagination is always all that is possible in the terms of, serious political intervention. The rest is, I think, the day-to-day of operating within already existing political realities, right? So within a political reality, you can change laws, you can do certain things, but to recreate, to become, I think you have to have imagination. So I don't really see it as all that is left. I see it as the most important thing that we have to do. In terms of Auda, the right of return, again, these are different things in terms of, how do we, I'm not saying that people shouldn't work on legal changes and, of course, in terms of, what needs to be done that I think is obvious is that certain ideas of, we need to rethink the whole idea of rights and land and, because it opens up to the question of, birthright and et cetera, et cetera. So, I guess in the book itself, the way in which return is discussed is in the project of a future and a future return. But once again, already in the book, the return is to a future in which Palestine and Lebanon and the entire territories are no longer the territories that there are today, right? They're this expanded territory. So it's already out of the kind of political moment that we see in the borders that allow us to see it. And if we want to go back to the concept of the archive, of course, this is what Foucault would tell us is the archive, right? The archive is what is supposed to limit our ability to see beyond the borders of the sayable and the possible. So we're supposed to constantly not be able to conceive of anything that has a nature of becoming because it's out of the archive. I hope that was an answer.
Sorry, did you want to jump in before I move to the next question? I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, just super briefly, just to say that, I mean, just on this question of return, that book I was referring to earlier by Salman Abu Sitta, I mean, one of the amazing things about that book is that even though it's heavily about the past and about, who came from which village and where did these people end up and so on and so forth, tracing trajectories of dispossession and exile and so on. He's also worked in that book and in other places too on return, obviously, and like just kind of basically just turn everything around. And one of the amazing things about his work is that, like, for example, in the case of Gaza, I mean, like so we think about return as this thing that's, wow, it's like, 2026. No, that's not as far off in the future as it once sounded. You know what I mean? Like 2058 or something way off in the future, right? But actually, one of the points he makes in that book and in other projects is that literally, if you open the gates of Gaza and told everybody you can go home now, they could literally walk to where their villages used to be. That's how close they are. And so, the land of the villages is still uninhabited for like 85% of cases. So it's kind of extraordinary how, when you boil it down to, the realm of what's realistically possible and how imaginable what seems otherwise to be something that seems to be unimaginable is, it's kind of extraordinary. But I just thought I'd just add that on the question of return.
And the next question has to do with gestures. Have you thought about, or were you wondering how it is that gestures accumulate across bodies, or in a sense diachronically, to become part of the archive or repertoire?
Yeah, that's great. I do write about that in the chapter on dance, because I think that Saleh actually works a lot with this idea of movement that goes across bodies. And I also do address the idea that, that archive and repertoire are not necessary. We have come to think about them, I think, following Taylor's work as opposed or different. And I suggest that they're not. And mostly it's because my entire sort of reading of archives is in terms of citation, right? Of Roland Barthes' concept of citation and recitationality. And so it is all out repertoire. But I address it in more length in the book.
And we'll just take one last question from Evan. And he says, are oral histories more akin to art in their potential imaginations of the future, or oral histories, are they still part of a traditional archive that is more concerned with debates over facts? Or is the answer less about oral history itself and more about how it is interpreted and engaged with by a critic such as yourself?
I guess I didn't really make I don't make a distinction between oral traditions or written traditions, in the sense that I don't, to begin with, sort of accept the kind of definitions of societies of archives, the ones that put things down in text and others that don't have archives. So it's kind of not a place of departure for me. I think yeah, I mean, I don't really know how to fully address this, because I I think that in some context there is a lot of importance placed on the difference between oral tradition and written ones in depth, but it's mostly because there has been such a fixation on documentation when it comes to archives, and that is something that, again, the mostly discipline of history with capital H has done, and it has created also ideas that there are cultures that are archival and cultures that are not archival. I just, it's not part of my beginning set, and actually not part of any of the archives looked at by the artists that I look at, some of which, some look at text, but others look at film, of course, or photography, some at vegetation, pieces of runes, some, and in many of them there is actually, now that I think about it, a strong presence of oral tradition, both in Jomana Mana's film. There is scenes of oral tradition in the film, of the both of her own father, who's a historian. And it's interesting because he gives his account, but also of other figures. In Camilla Jafari's film, there is accounts of oral tradition. So it's I don't have a division, and I think that they're all one expansion. It's all about how those sources are activated. I do want to say one thing that goes back to Sari's question of how to see these things. Maybe I'll just say that I think these artists, time and again, because they made me think, and they make me hope and dream. And I think that if anything is important, is for people to actually engage with the work itself. Almost all of them have their own webpage, and some of them are happy to share things openly. Some of them would ask for a fee because they have to, but they're all, you can, they're not going to be on Amazon, but they, which is a good thing, but they're all Googleable. Is that how you say that?
Googleable.
Googleable.
Google.
And you can, and some of them are just really available. You can just watch it. But if you don't find it, sorry, then write me. And they're all amazing, amazing works. They're so talented. It's just a pleasure.
So thank you, Gil, for sharing this really compelling work with us, and also introducing us, or many of us, I think, to artists whom we didn't know before. And I think that many of us are going to go out and search for these artists in just the way that you indicated. I've been fortunate to see a couple of the pieces you talk about, and they're amazing. And I'm so excited to go see the rest. So I'm really grateful to you. I'm really grateful to Rachel and Sari for their really stimulating comments and questions about the book and about this incredibly important topic. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to remind you we've got 2 upcoming events on March 14th and April 27th. And I think we didn't exactly plan this to work out this way, but I think the other two books, Mihaela Mihai's book on political memory and Kevin Brunel's book on settler memory, are going to really follow very nicely from the topics that you take up in your book and that we've started to talk about here, because in the case of Mihai's book, it's really a book about impure forms of resistance and everyday forms of complicity, which really resonates with your book. And Kevin Brunel's book on settler memory, I think the connections will be very obvious when we get to that as well in a more US context. So thank you again, Gil. Thank you to the other organizers, Sharon, Rebecca, and Yair, to the audience, and see you next time. And yeah, look forward to that.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Thank you all.
Bye.